going. Welcome to lecture number 4 for Construction Management 1. What we're going to do tonight is just quickly have a look at the contract administration side. So typically this would be topics number 5 and 6, I think, in your study guide. So those topics are typically really short. In the study guide, it's only a few pages. There's a little bit of resource material, so you do have to do a little bit of research on that. So the resources that you might need for this one, depending on the textbook that you've got, 1996, 1994, I think those of you who have 1996 textbooks, you shouldn't have a problem, but if you do have a 1994 textbook, those are the pages that you can find the information on. So 3.1 all the way through to 3.69, and then of course the video lectures that we did for lecture number 2 and lecture number 3. All of that stuff in combination will give you a good go, and you'll be able to get going on that. So the thing to remember here is you'll typically need this information for your last assignment. You are going to think about your business model. How are you going to entertain your clients? How are you going to manipulate your situation? Which contracts are you going to choose? And depending on the business model that you've selected, if you're an entrepreneurial organization that creates new things, you might choose a certain type of contract. If you're a sort of a cookie cutter type project, a management company, you might choose a different type of project. So all of these things typically go hand in hand. You have to think about it. All right, so what I tried to do there is on one single slide, show you everything that we're going to do tonight. All right, so what we're going to talk tonight about is just all about contracts. All right, so contract administration, really important part in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis, and we need to know our way around these contracts. Now, you don't need to be an expert. Typically, on any project, you'll have a contract administrator that will hang around, maybe a senior partner as well, and they'll look after that. But it's always a good idea to just have a fair idea of how these things fit in together. Now, so I dabbled in contracts for a number of years. I found it really interesting. It's really a lucrative business. Maybe not so much in small-time construction projects, but in large infrastructure projects, definitely there's a lot of money in managing the contract side of a project, especially once you get to that critical mass type knowledge area where people know you are and you've built up a little bit of a reputation for yourself, and they know you're an expert in a specific type of contract. All right, so we see there that typically if we look at what's on the screen there, let's see if I can get my pen going there and choose a red color. So if we look at that one, if there's a void contract, obviously then no problems at all. The contract just falls away. However, how do we cancel a contract that's actually a legal contract? All right, so there's a number of ways to go through it. The first thing that we have to ask is, was this actually a legal contract? Did we enter into this contract under duress? Were we forced into it? Was somebody keeping a gun to our head? Or were they making some kind of threat against us? Or were they unduly influencing us some way or another? Right, so if we answer all those questions, we can say yes, we can void it because there's misrepresentation. For instance, the seller said that the product that we were going to buy would be able to do certain stuff, and it's not going to be able to do that. Or alternatively, duress, we might be forced into that situation, gun against the head, and it might be a lot more subtle than that. For instance, there might just be a subtle hint about future work. All right, so that would also be duress over there. And then, of course, undue influence. Typically, you'll see that in large organizations where people will say, in the view of our continuing business relationship, don't you want to think about lowering your price, or don't you think you can maybe give us a better deal? And that might force you into that typical contract. So if we look at the other side of the slide, on this side of the fence, I try to put a little border around it so that it's sort of separate. For a valid contract, obviously we do an offer. We'll talk about the offers just now. You have to make an offer, and there's different ways of dealing with an offer. So let's say there's an offer on the table. You really don't like the offer, and you make a counter offer. What's happened to that original offer? What's happened to it? Does anybody want to take a chance on that question? You can type it in the chat window if you like, or alternatively you can click on the talk button and just join us. All right, so I see Ray has joined us, so welcome Ray. I can see there's a little bit of a delay on your side yet, so hopefully you'll pick up the side. Right, so the question was, if there's an offer on the table and we make a counter offer, what happens to the original offer? Obviously the original offer falls away and it's no longer available. Yeah, there we are. And Mark, you're also having some delays. What I might get you guys to do, I'll just pause the recording. Well, actually we don't need to pause the recording. If you guys can click on Edit on your screen, at the top there's a toolbar that's File, Edit, View Tools. All right, so click on Edit, go down to Preferences, and then if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see there's one that says Connection. It's under the heading that says Session, and just click on Connection there. And just choose a lower speed. So if you're struggling with serious delays on your side, can you just make sure that you select the lowest speed? So typically either wireless or ISDN, that might be a good choice, and then the system will automatically be able to accommodate the way it works, and you should be able to pick up speed. All right, so can you just let me know by showing me a little tick mark if you understood what are those instructions that I gave? All right, so Reese, you've got it. All right, excellent. And Mark, you've also done it. I can see Ray, you still have some delays over there. All right, so we'll keep on going. If it continues, what we might do is just get you to log in, log out again, and see if that helps. All right, so let's think about our offer over there. We said that if we accept the offer, obviously that now constitutes a contract for us. And for a contract to be legal, there's a few things that we have to think about. It has to be a consensus, so both parties have to agree, and it can be multiple parties. Both parties must have legal capacity. So if you're working for a large organization, you have to have a board resolution saying yes, you are the person that's going to sign this contract on the company's behalf, so that the vendor and the buyer knows that the legal capacities has actually been fulfilled. There's also the formalities that we have to fulfill. All right, so that would typically be the aspects of the contract that's required. So for instance, if there's some kind of stamp duty to be paid, in order to formalize that, those formalities need to be made sure that we do satisfy those formalities. Then there's absolute and relative possibility. So is it actually possible to execute this contract? Right, so let's say for instance we're going to go into a contract to use skyhooks, for instance. All right, so we all know skyhooks does not exist, therefore it's not really a legal contract, it's not possible to use. All right, what about the next question, lawful? If we think about a simple example, last time I checked, prostitution in Australia was still illegal. That might change at any point in time, but I think at the moment it's still illegal. So if you contract with a prostitute for a specific type of service, which we won't go into deep to, and she fails to satisfy the requirements of that specific scope of work, then you have to ask the question, was this in the first place a lawful contract? Because it's against the law of the country. All right, so that raises some serious question marks for us in terms of the legality of the contract. If we look at the end of the contract, there's two ways of doing it. We can either perform as the contract requires, or so if you contract to build a house, You go in, supply the material, and effectively construct the house, and there you go. The contract is end. All right. Alternatively, if things go awry and you go into a nasty situation, you might choose cancellation. All right. So in terms of cancellation, there might be a little bit of fallout. So there might be penalties, or there might be performance damages that we'll have to address in terms of the contract. All right. So there we go. There's a little bit of info. That's basically what we're going to have a look at tonight. Any questions so far? If you can give me any kind of idea, any questions in the chat window, you can show it there. Alternatively, I'll just keep on going, and you guys can either listen to me or mute me and listen to something on the radio. All right, so let's have a look at the contract definition. We all know what contracts are. Why are they there? It creates an obligation between the two parties. Somebody wants something, somebody else wants to sell something. We bring those two parties together, that they negotiate, and we say, yes, all right, we'll go into that contract. So for instance, if we buy a car, second-hand car, let's say Reese is in the market for a Commodore, and Mark, you've got one that you want to sell. We bring you two guys together, maybe through an advert in the newspaper. You have a look at the price, and Mark, you offer to sell your Commodore for a certain price. Let's say you offer to sell your Commodore for $12,000, and Reese, you say, yeah, $12,000 sounds like a real bargain. I'm going to buy it, and there's our legal obligation between the two parties. Reese gives you the cash, Mark, you give him the car, and everybody's happy. All right, so that's the most basic way of looking at it. And that's what I say there on the slide. One party has the right to performance, all right? So, and both parties can be on both sides of the fence. All right, so in both cases, somebody needs to perform from the one side and somebody needs to receive from the other side. So that's the easiest way of thinking about it. All right, so there we go. There's our contract definition, nice and simple. So why do we have these things? Why do we have contracts in place? And typically we have these contracts in place to protect ourselves. So imagine working in the construction industry as you going out to a bar on a Friday afternoon. All right, so early on during the afternoon, you're still completely sober, and you're quite happy to talk to many people around the bar. Later on during the night, the things get more hairy. There's a little bit more alcohol flowing, which is basically, I'm sort of suggesting that that represents the state of the economy. So you lower your standards and you decide to enter into a service delivery contract with a service provider that you met in the bar, which might be a girl or a guy, depending on which way you want to go. And how do you protect yourself? Obviously, you use the right protection, and this is exactly the same for us. So we find somebody that can do the work for us, and we make sure that we protect ourselves using the right type of contract. All right, so it creates the chessboard. It gives us the rules and regulations for our game that we're going to play, and it tells us what each of the role players are going to do. All right, so very important. It's going to be able to define the role players or the different roles. All right, so very important for us is we need to make sure that we understand who is going to do what. So the roles and the responsibilities need to go into our contract. All right, so at the end of the day, what is the effect when we talk about something like a verbal contract? Is a verbal contract legal? Yes, yes. In some cases we can say yes, it's a legal contract. But the problem with verbal contracts is, of course, that it's difficult to prove. So unless you have 2 or 3 witnesses with you, it becomes a little bit of a quagmire or a minefield. You have to sidestep a few issues. I always used to say that in terms of verbal instructions, if it's not on paper, it's vapor. And that sort of stood me well for many years in the industry. So always make sure that you do get the stuff on paper so that you know you've got a fallback position. All right, so how do we form that specific contract? We spoke about this earlier. It needs to be consensus, right, between 2 or more parties. So there might be a multitude of parties that's going to do the contract work. So let's say there's 5 contractors, and they are going to work on a multidisciplinary contract, right? So we might have a reciprocal agreement between these 5 parties, or we might have individual contracts, depending on how we want to set this up. And of course then, you might have an overarching agreement as well with a managing consultant. All right. Alternatively, especially in the EPCM fields, we see these overarching agreements, turning up more and more in the industry, where we might have the client on the one side. So there's our client, and then of course over there's our supplier. Let's call him a supplier S, and let's think about an example. We're going to build a big pipeline. The pipeline is approximately 600 kilometers, and it runs from an inland town all the way out to the coast, and it's a multi-product pipeline. Also, using pigs, we can ship different types of liquid through this pipeline. Also, company S, the supplier over there, has very extensive experience in this field, so they contract together with the client, which might be a parastatal or a state organization in this case, because it's a large capital investment, and they work together. So together they come up with the design for our pipeline. So imagine there's our pipeline, and they come up for the design, and they work out the route, what's the best way to do it, and between the two of them, they might come up with an overarching agreement to say, all right, we become partners. And this is now where you have to start thinking about lecture number 2 and 3. All right, we spoke about pain and gain type contracts, and typically this would be a good scenario for a pain or gain type contract. All right, so different scenarios calls for different types of contracts. I'll leave it up to you guys to decide based on the information that you have available. No one contract is ever the same as another one. There's always going to be changes, and it's always fun sorting out the different types of contracts that's on a specific project. All right, so just checking in with Mark, Ray, and Reese. Are you all still okay? If you can give me a tick mark, just to say yes, you're still okay, you can still hear me. All right, so Reese, you there, Mark, you there, and, well, Ray's there, and there we go, Mark. All right, excellent. So at any point, if you guys have any questions, be sure to just either put up your hand. You can put up your hand by just clicking on the little hand icon there, or alternatively in the chat window, and I'll be able to pick it up from there. All right, so moving on to the next slide. There's our offer. All right, so we need to understand how an offer works. All right, and you offer to buy something, or you offer to sell something. All right, so that's the most basic way of thinking about it. So if we think about our example previously about Reese and Mark selling the Commodore, let's just say there's Mark. I'll just use an M for Mark. Mark says he wants $12,000 for his nice Commodore. It's an automatic, it's got nice tires on it, special radio, and it's got metallic paint. Reese on the other side says, all right, I've just started my career. I had a look at this Commodore of yours, it's really nice. However, I would like you to put a aerofoil on the back. All right, you want a little fin on the back. All right, so let's see if I can draw the Commodore. There's the Commodore. It's a very old model Commodore according to my drawing, but there's the Commodore. And Reese says, yes, he wants to add a fin. I don't know what you call it, wing, fin, aerofoil, whatever. Aerofoil typically sits on the front, but yep, let's say you want to add a wing over there. And if, Mark, you add the wing, I'll buy it for $12,000. All right, so what did Reese do just now by asking for the wing on the back of the Commodore? What happened? What did he ask for? Anyone want to take a guess at that one? Is the old offer still available? Is it cancelled? Did it fall away? Is it an amendment? What do you guys think? How did it work? All right, so it changed. All right, so Reese says, yep, it's changed the offer. And yes, Ray is actually right. Ray says that Reese made a counter offer. All right, so the original offer is no longer on the table. All right, because you said you're going to want these, or the wing on the back of your car that actually counters the original offer and the offer is no longer available. All right, so in that case, let's say Mark is a real hard ass and he says, no, I'm definitely not going to put up anything on my nice Commodore. And Reese later decides, okay, well, in that case, I'll buy the car from you for $12,000. Can Mark now go back and say, oh, sorry, the $12,000 is no longer on the table. This car is now $13,500. Would that be legal? Yes. All right. So there we go. And Ray says yes, that would be perfectly okay. Because the original offer is gone, it's no longer valid, and you can now ask any price. All right. So there we go. It's interesting how these things work. So especially if you guys are tendering and working on estimation of big projects, it's really important to keep this in mind. The moment you start adding and stipulating specifications as a counter to your original offer for RFI, you start going onto a slippery slope. So make sure that you know exactly where you want to go with that by the time you go. All right, so there's our next slide, tenders. So why do we have tenders? Typically, we invite people to come and give us a price. So different ways of calling for this. There might be a request for quotation. So a tender, request for quotation, all of these things are typically along the same lines. Depending on the type of tender that's out there, it might be a binding tender, or it might be a tender where there's a clause in that says the lowest or any offer might not necessarily be accepted. So you'll typically always see that clause in there, and that is just to make sure that if the client decides that no, this isn't really a good deal, this isn't really the deal that I want, he's got something that he can use to get out of there. All right, so make sure that you've also gone through the tender requirements, gone through the tender specifications, you understand exactly what's required. And what we'll see, these the more experienced the companies become, let's say it's a large corporate organization that's continuous in doing developments, obviously they become more fluent in how to do it, and the tendering with them become more easier. Because they work on templates and they give you standard things that you have to tender on. And the reason why they give you standard templates is so that the adjudication or the evaluation of those different tenders are a lot easier if everybody uses the same forms. Alright, so that's always the key thing. If you, let's say for instance, you sit on the client side, you have to make it as easy as possible for yourself to do the marking at the end of the day. And to a certain extent, that is what I'm doing with this course as well. I give you guys the marking sheets well ahead of time so that you can see how I'm going to assess it. And I do that in the hope to see that you might follow what I've given you and making my job a little bit easier. All right, so there we go. We've spoken about the expiry of the offer. All right, so if the offer was not accepted, obviously it just falls. So what is a reasonable time? So what is a reasonable time? You have to come up with an idea of what will the court say is the reasonable time for an offer to expire if you did not add a little bit of time onto it. All right, so there's our time limit. If it was only open for a certain period of time, what happens when that period of time has expired? Obviously, the offer falls away. There's our definition for a reasonable time. Not sure if you guys are familiar with asterisks and obelisks. Can you give me a show of hands? Who's read the cartoon asterisks and obelisks before? Or even maybe have heard of them? No, Reese, you've never heard of them. All right, so another character that I might use is in Lord of the Rings. There's the old grey guy. He represents the knowledgeable guy, and he would be experienced, and typically an easy way of saying what would the reasonable guy do. He would be the guy that's going to answer that question and say, all right, 10 days is a reasonable time, 7 days is a reasonable time. Obviously, the larger the contract, the longer the time, the smaller the contract, the shorter the time. So it depends on exactly the circumstances that you're going to encounter. Right, well, another thing that will definitely cancel our offer is, of course, if the person that's making the offer dies. All right, so that becomes permanently impossible, all right, because he's no longer there, and therefore it falls away. And then, of course, we can just outright reject it, or we can sort of pull it back. So I'm not sure exactly how to pull it back. I'm going to draw that, but let's use an arrow. And there we go, and we can see those are the reasons or the ways that we're going to cancel it. All right, so there's I've given you a little bit of a slide about rejection and clarification. Oh, thanks, Mark. I'll see you. Yep, let me know. I'll see you in the next lecture. I think the next lecture is only next year in January. Everybody's going on leave. So I'll see you when you get back from holiday, or alternatively, if you need something, just let me know. All right. Okay, great. Thanks. All right, so for the rejection and the clarification and revocation of our offer, there's certain processes that we have to go through. A qualified acceptance. All right, so if we say there's the fin or the wing on the back of the Commodore, all right, that actually is a qualified acceptance. All right, so put the fin or the wing on, and then I'll buy it for $12,000. The same applies to contracting in the big world. Right? So if we say, I'll do this work if you pay me at the 30-day mark, you know, it has some implications for us. And you can read through the rest of the slide there. I've given you a few ideas that you can think about. So how do we deal with the acceptance of an offer? We can, it must be accepted in whole. All right, so the moment there's a counter offer, it sort of falls away, and unconditionally. All right, so if we add conditions, obviously it means that we are going to do changes. So I'll draw a little triangle there. Delta triangle means changes. If we do changes, obviously the offer falls away and it's no longer available. And of course, it must be accepted by the person that it was addressed to. So if it's an organization that requested an offer for the work to be executed on a specific project, it has to go back to that specific organization according to the tender specifications. All right, and of course, it has to be in reaction to an offer. If it's not in reaction to an offer, it actually becomes an offer in itself. All right, so think about that nicely. So I'll say it again, if it's not in a reaction to an offer, it actually becomes an offer itself. So somebody is offering to do some work for which there was no requirement previously. All right, so how do we form the contract? Obviously, it has to be communicated, right? There has to be a formal acceptance, and that acceptance needs to be known by both parties. So there's a few rules that we have to think about. So for instance, postal contracts. Right? If we think about postal contracts, they're always interesting to deal with, because when does a postal contract actually get to be formed? So when does it come into power? And if we think about a postal contract, let's say you take out some life insurance, you post your life insurance acceptance form on the Friday, and on the Saturday you die in a motor vehicle accident. Is that a binding contract? So in terms of the current Australian law, yes it is, because it was posted, and at that time it becomes legal. So those are the interesting things that you can always think about in terms of how to form this contract. It needs to be informed of the acceptance, so both parties need to know about it. In terms of postal contracts, however, the law makes provision for it to say, all right, as soon as it was posted, that is the notice to the other party. All right, so there we go, the place of formation. This one is quite tricky, really important when you deal with international projects. So there's always going to be a place in the contract to say the law of the country is. All right, so if you are going to work in an international location, make sure that you stipulate the right country. All right? And also bear in mind that if the contract is signed in a country other than the law of the country, it becomes troublesome. So let's say, for instance, I want to sell my house in Johannesburg, in Pretoria, or Johannesburg in South Africa, and I sign the sale of contract in Australia. I actually have to travel all the way to Canberra to go to the South African consulate to sign the paper on South African ground. Right? So that's a South African condition, because the law of the contract is the law of South Africa in that case. Right? So if you're going to do some work, contracting work in Africa, let's say for instance Nigeria, typically the law of Nigeria is going to be applicable. You cannot enforce a different country's law while you're working in another country. Right? So you can't say Australian law is now going to be in power while I'm working in Nigeria. So the Nigerians will just laugh at you, and you will have to spend many US dollars or Nairas to make sure you grease the wheels. However, these days we call it motivational spending, and see if we can get that going. Alright, so for our contracts, there's 5 requirements. There has to be consensus. Remember that first slide. So there's our two parties. Both of them must say yes, we agree with them. If one party says no, then in that case the whole contract falls over and it's not valid. Alright, it needs to be physically possible to do. Alright, so if you are going to contract to send a man to Mars, you have to think about this. Is it possible? Might not be possible at the moment, so therefore it's not going to be a legal or a valid contract. So that's maybe not the best example, because just now somebody gets to send somebody there, but you get the drift of where I'm going. Lawfulness, alright, remember our prostitute. Let's say for instance, Reese, I'm going to use you again. Reese contracts a specific service provider called Beauty, and Beauty is providing services to Reese. Reese is somewhat disappointed by the services provided by Beauty, and he fails to pay. Alright, so what legal standpoint can Beauty now employ to get the funds from Reese? Actually, there's no real legal doctrine for her to rely upon. She can't get the money because there's no legal contract. However, what Beauty can do is Beauty can call her good friend, Bubba, which is about twice the size that Reese is, and he will motivate Reese in no uncertain terms to transfer the necessary cash. All right, so there we go. That's a good example of lawfulness. All right, so formalities, we have to make sure that the stamp duties are done, it's signed at the right place, it's signed by the right people in the right period of time with the specifications of our tender. All right, so we'll talk about the formalities just now. I've got 1 or 2 slides coming up just on that. And then, of course, the contractual capacity. Remember what we said about the contractual capacity. This is where we say, yes, the board of directors has given us a board resolution, and Ray is the person that is going to put his signature on the contract, and there it is. So typically what that will be, it will be a board resolution, something like that, that will give the name and designation of that person to say, yes, we can do the contract, and therefore it's a valid contract. All right, so how do we unmake the contract? How can we rescind it? All right, so it happens with marriages as well. All right, and of course it can happen in terms of contracts. So the key things that we have to remember there's basically those 4 things that we have to think about. Misrepresentation. You said that you were Superman and that you can walk on water. It turns out you're not, and that you sink like the rest of us. Therefore, it's misrepresentation, and it's therefore not a valid contract. Duress, you pulled out a 45 automatic pistol, and you put it against the supplier Z and said, all right, you'll have to now supply me with this product. All right, so that would be duress. Undue influence on the golf course while you're playing a friendly game of golf with the supplier or the employer for the next contract, you make a statement to say that it might be in the best interests of this company to lower their price, because who knows what will happen in future contract awards. So undue influence, the line is really thin. That's a thin red line that you always have to think about. So the innocent party can say, yes, we want to rescind, or no, we're not going to rescind. We actually think it's okay and we can continue. All right, so the fact that these things have happened doesn't necessarily lead to a rescinded contract. It can, but not always. All right, so there's our formalities that we have to think about. This is a good example. If you buy stuff, property, for instance, land, the contract must be in writing. All right, something else that you have to remember, let's say you've got a big farm, and Telstra wants to put up a mobile mast on your farm for their cellular telecommunications. You'll see that typically those contracts will only run for 9 years and 11 months. So the reason for that is anything longer than 10 years have to go onto the title deed. Lots and lots of cash that needs to be separated there, and it's really an expensive exercise. So typically those are the formalities that we have to think about. All right, so for construction contracts, different formalities. All right, so we'll have secondary conditions in there, primary conditions, changes in the law, who takes care of inflation, who takes care of acts of God, force majeure, all of those things that would typically be formality or examples of formalities as well. All right, so terms and stipulations, almost there. I think this is maybe one of the last slides that we've got. I might be wrong. All right, so it needs to be expressed in the contract. So if we have a contract that forces us into a specific direction, it needs to be in the contract. It needs to be in clear, understandable language. So lawyer speak is always difficult to understand. So make sure that if you become a contract administrator, that you understand the rules of the game. It's basically a chess game that you play. So the person that knows the rules the best, he typically tends to win the game at the end. All right, so what goes into a contract is obviously the essential stipulations. So for instance, the headers, the general conditions of the contract, the natural implied terms that goes in there, which are basically definitions, and you'll see that in each and every one of those contracts there's a section that have these definitions, and it's one of the things that's always going to be in a contract. There can also be additional stipulations, for instance, the terms, additional terms, the conditions that we provide for any kind of provisions that we have to make in terms of the contract. Right? So this might be secondary and primary conditions that we have to put in. We might even have stuff about the guarantees. Right? So the risk register might be in there, the penalties that will be paid, the rewards. Remember, if you're going to charge penalties, you always have to have an incentive as well, which just goes both ways. So if it's a penalty for late completion, why don't you have a sort of incentive for early completion? All right, so those would typically be the bare minimum. By no means will this be a comprehensive list, but this gives you a good idea of what the bare minimum is for a specific type of contract. All right, so the incidental terms, all right, so these might be special requirements. It has to be determined by either the buyer or the seller. All right, so, and you would have to remember the natural terms, they are always going to be there. The natural ones will always be in the contract itself, but incidental ones will have to be introduced separate to that. So if we just go back one slide, see if I can get going. There we go. One more slide back. There we go. So there's our incidental stipulations. Natural stipulations will always be in that separate area there. All right. So any questions so far? A few examples of incidental clauses or incidental terms that's there. Something about time. All right. So for instance, we have a suspensive clause. So, for instance, when something happens in the future, it's not it's certain, but it's uncertain when. So, for instance, at some point in time, Julia Gillard will have to step down for health reasons, or because she gets voted out of the parliament. So that's something that we're uncertain about. And the same with the example that I've given you there, when Paul dies. All right, so warranties, guarantees, all of those are is the same. It's all about something that's going to happen in the future. So that things in the future. So we have to think about how are we going to deal with that when it happens in the future. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. Let's see if I can get that going. Any questions from anybody? Well, basically I only have Reese and Ray. So no questions from Ray. Thank you very much, Ray. Any questions from Reese? Nothing from you guys? All right, so what I'm going to do next week is, not sure exactly when I'm going to do it, but I'm going to have a program-wide training day for the use of Collaborate. And you guys, I'll have multiple sessions. It might not be next week because I know everybody's going on leave, and next week might be a little bit hectic, but somewhere early in January we might have that session. And we'll have a play day with Blackboard Collaborate, so that's in preparation for your presentations for your assignment number 4, and I will definitely put that up onto the news forum. All right, so just have a look out and make sure that you guys stay ahead of that when it comes out. All right, so if there are no more questions, we might call it a day, and there's no lecture next week, so I'll see you guys, unless you ask for a separate lecture, only next year again. All right, so thanks for attending, and I'll see you guys next time.